Hello, everyone. This week, you're continuing to study early modern literature as we continue to make our way through Shakespeare and thinking about some of the work he was doing. We're also going to be reflecting on the work of a couple of women poets of the time, Aemilia Lanyer and Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz. And even though these two women were born roughly 80 years apart from one another, and even though their circumstances were very different in a lot of ways, both in terms of where they were born and the world in which they came up, um, I hope that we can find some common threads and some common connections between the works of these two influential women poets. So what I want to do today is just talk first a little bit about each of their biographies, a little bit about the context in which they were living and working, and then spend a little bit of time looking at the two poems that you read, the one by Aemilia Lanyer, Eve's Apology in Defense of Women, and the one by Sor Juana, which is called A Philosophical Satire. So let's start by talking a little bit about Aemilia Lanyer. Now you've heard briefly about Aemilia Lanyer in Dr. Walker Eden's lecture that she gave on Milton and Donne. In particular, Dr. Walker Eden talked a little bit about Lanyer's presentation of Eve, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. But just for some background, she's born in 1569, and she is the daughter of a court musician of Elizabeth I, someone who was from Venice, at least according to accounts, but had come to work in England. And so she grows up close to the royal court. Even though her father dies when she's 7, she still finds herself connected to the royal court, coming up within that world, growing up in that world, and coming under the sphere of influence, or coming into the sphere of influence of a number of people who were connected to the court. And of course, these connections, this is not new for writers that we've looked at, whether we're talking about Chaucer or the Sidneys or others. Many writers of this time, in order to be able to write, certainly in order to be able to get published, often had to have these kinds of connections. Now, Lanyer also received an early education. As a child, she was taught in the classics and in religion and literature. And of course, some of these ideas will make their way into her poetry. Not just because of where she was born and the world she came up in, but also, according to all accounts, because of her intelligence and charisma. She was a young woman who was eminently admired. She enjoyed the favor of several prominent people. She finds herself throughout her life in connection and in contact with a number of prominent people, both inside the royal court and outside the royal court. One of these prominent people was the Lord Hunsdon, who was the Queen's Lord Chamberlain. And the Lord Chamberlain is essentially the highest ranking official in the court. So we can think of it as someone who was very close to the Queen, who oversaw finances and matters of business for the royal court. And Aemilia Lanyer became his mistress at a young age. However, when she became pregnant with his child, in order to avoid scandal, she was married off to Alfonso Lanyer, who, like her father, was a court musician. Early in the 17th century, so under the reign of King James, Lanyer begins her writing career, or what she had hoped would become a writing career. It's believed that she's the first woman in the English-speaking world to publish a book of her own poetry. And she also very clearly, in the way that she wrote this book and the way she published this book, was seeking patronage. As we've talked about before, in order for an artist to really make any kind of living, they needed to have wealthy patrons at this time. And she sought this. She seems to really be seeking patronage. And again, while she had support from a number of people, she never really found the patronage that she was after. However, her work, Salve Deus Rex Judorum, of which you read an excerpt called Eve's Apology in Defense of Women. As I said, this is thought to be the first book of poetry published by a woman in English, so quite an accomplishment. The title means Hail God, King of the Jews. And so it's a work, there are a number of poems in the work, but the title poem, Salve Deus Rex Judorum, is a long poem about the Passion of Christ, about the crucifixion of Jesus. And of course, Eve's apology in the defense of women, as we'll talk about, comes from this poem and is situated within a moment in the Passion of Christ. So a fitting poem to be talking about this week as we look ahead towards Holy Week next week and Easter. She dedicates this work, Salve Deus Rex Judorum, to a series of prominent women, not unlike Christine de Pizan, maybe, whom we've also read. She wanted to cultivate connections among women, connections among important women, and so she dedicates this work to a number of them, and seeks connection with women throughout her world, whether they're artists, whether they're noble women, but people that she wants to elevate. And so this work is considered for this reason, because of its target audience of prominent women, but also because of the subject matter. It's considered to be a proto-feminist work. When I say proto-feminist, what I mean is a work that expresses, ideas that will later come to be labeled as feminist. No one would have called Aemilia Lanyer a feminist in her time. It wasn't really a word or an idea that was in use. But later generations of scholars have looked back and seen how these important ideas in her work were perhaps pointing forward to the elevation of women in art and in society. Lanyer died in 1645 at the age of 76. And as I said, she never really attained the level of patronage that she wanted. But she was known at her death to have a steady income from other endeavors. She managed to make a living in other ways. So let's turn to Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz, again, before looking at the poems by each of these women, and look a little bit at her biography. So she's born around 1651 in Mexico to a single mother. Her father was Spanish, and her mother was Creole, but her father didn't have much contact with her throughout her life, and she grew up in her grandfather's home. From an early age, she was something of a prodigy. She was an avid reader, a voracious reader of all kinds of texts, and she valued education above all else. In some of the excerpts from the reply to Sor Philotea, part of which you read, she talks a little bit about her education and how much she loved education, how much she valued education, and how at a young age, she even gave up the eating of cheese because she learned that, or she believed that eating cheese would dull her wits. She wanted her mind to always be sharp. So rather than eat cheese, which she loved, she gave it up in order to have a mind that was sharp to read and to analyze texts. Of course, later as well, she will cut off her hair because she sees having long hair as a distraction to the work of reading. So such basic things as food and her physical appearance, she saw as not as important as her love of learning and her love of education. She does begin writing poetry as a young girl. Her first poem that we know of was written when she was 8 years old. And she also taught herself a vast array of subjects. When you read her work, you see her talking about the classics and about literature and about theology and about the Bible, of course, but also about the sciences. She taught herself just simply by reading books in her grandfather's library, by reflecting on them, and a vast array of subjects. And at the age of 17, news was starting to spread about this young prodigy. And so she was given an intelligence test by the viceroy of her region, a local noble. She stood before a panel and answered a series of questions. She astonished the panel. They were amazed at her depth of learning for such a young woman. And so her reputation began to grow. Along with her beauty, she was widely thought to be a very beautiful young woman as well. And so she gains the attention of a number of suitors, all of whom want to marry her. Of course, this is not what she wants. She does not want to get married. She wants to pursue a life of learning, and she feels, probably rightly, that by getting married at that time, it would effectively close off the opportunities she would have at scholarship and writing. So partly to avoid marriage, but also because of religious devotion, she enters a convent as a young woman. And from that convent, she is going to pursue her writing and her scholarship for the rest of her life. In 1690, so when she was just shy of 40 years old, a letter of hers was published, and it's published without her permission. A local bishop um, who has encouraged her to write. She has been encouraged by the church, not that bishop particularly, but she's been encouraged by the church to write a reflection on the teaching of a certain preacher. She writes a critique, and not with the understanding that it would ever be published. And yet this bishop publishes this letter of hers without her permission. And she is censured. She is publicly condemned for writing it. This is in large part why she writes her reply to Philotea de la Cruz. And in her response, she discusses a number of things. Again, she talks about her reason for writing the letter that she did. She speaks to the fact that she was compelled by those above her. She was compelled by her superiors to write this work, that she did not write of her own, just out of a desire to critique this teacher. Certainly, she did not publish this work out of a desire to critique this teacher. But she also discusses her early education. She discusses the difficulties that she faces as a woman and her service to the church. Hopefully, in your reading of this text, you see some of that. You see the story that she's telling. You see her yearning for education, how she talks about the importance of learning, not just in theology, but also the sciences and the humanities. And this is a work that maybe more than anything, it displays her remarkable intelligence, but also her ironic wit. She is at times self-deprecating. She is at times kind of ironically deferential to her superiors. But at the same time, she's demonstrating a kind of humble posture towards those to whom she is writing. And it's a really effective piece of rhetoric. So let's now turn to the two poems that you read, both fairly brief poems. And again, they're written, generations apart by women who are in very different life circumstances in a lot of ways. And yet they engage some common themes in ways that I want to talk about. So Eve's Apology in Defense of Women by Lanyer. As I said, this is part of a larger work, Salve Deus Rex Judorum. And this particular poem is set in the context of the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate. So Pilate is sort of standing on the threshold of making a judgment towards Jesus. And if you're familiar with the gospel story, you know that in the midst of that story, he receives word from his wife who says, "Don't have anything to do with this man. Don't condemn this man. I have suffered in a dream because of him." And so his wife kind of offers this word of wisdom to Pilate. And we know what Pilate's response is. He washes his hands of Jesus. He basically tells the crowd, his blood will be on your head. But he does not, even though he knows Jesus is innocent, he does not pronounce him so. He allows the crowd to determine Jesus's fate, which of course will be a cruel death by crucifixion. And in the larger sense, this poem speaks to the tendency of male interpreters of scripture to lay the blame for sin at the feet of Eve. And this is a common mode of interpretation of the story that we find in Genesis 3, certainly throughout the Christian tradition, and even before that, even within earlier commentators, it was common to blame Eve for the sin. Of course, Adam, as we see in this painting here, Adam blamed Eve. When God confronted Adam about his sin, he says, "It was the woman you gave me. She gave me the fruit to eat, and I ate it." And in Lanyer's poem, she wants to critique this tendency. And so she argues that Eve's decision to eat the fruit was made out of ignorance and innocence, but Pilate's decision to condemn Christ was made from a position of power. So she wants to argue from the premise that is so often accepted in society, that men have the power, men have sovereignty, men have authority. They make the decisions, and therefore to lay the blame for sin at the feet of Eve is not entirely fair. And certainly to lay the blame for sin at the feet of Eve, her transgression pales in comparison to some of the decisions men have made. So let's look at a few of the lines. She writes, "Till now your indiscretion sets us free and makes our former fault much less appear. Our mother Eve, who tasted of the tree, giving to Adam what she held most dear, was simply good and had no power to see. And so she is speaking again from the premise of looking at all the things that men have done, the indiscretions of men, and saying, our former fault, the fault that you laid on women because of the sin of Eve, now doesn't look so bad in the light of some of the decisions that you men have made. She speaks to Eve's intentions, to speak of Eve's motivations and intentions, right? She gave to Adam what she held most dear. She gave Adam the fruit out of love, right? She saw that the fruit was good. Genesis itself says that. She didn't know the destruction that eating the fruit would cause. She had no power to see that, Lanyer argues. She tasted something, it was good, and she gave to Adam, her husband, whom she loved, that which was good. And so, starting from a place of Eve's motivations in sharing the fruit, she argues for Eve's innocence here. She further argues, maybe ironically, that men are more to blame than women because, after all, they are stronger and more knowledgeable than women, or so they claim. Right? The idea that that men have authority, that men have more strength, that men should have the power. This should figure into the argument, Lanyer says. And so she writes, but surely Adam cannot be excused. Her fault, though great, yet he was most to blame. What weakness offered, strength might have refused. Being Lord of all, the greater was his shame. Although the serpent's craft had her abused, God's holy word ought all his actions frame. For he was Lord and King of all the earth before poor Eve had either life or breath. So Adam came first. Adam was older. Adam was wiser, or should have been. Adam had strength. So if Eve was really the weaker vessel, as men have so often argued, then what she offered in weakness, Adam in his strength should have known better. He should have had the strength to refuse it. So while we might blame her for what Lanyer calls an innocent transgression, the blame that should be shouldered by Adam is all the more great because he should have known better. He should have been more powerful in this situation. And finally, she brings her argument home by comparing Eve's transgression to those of the men who made the decision to crucify Christ. So when comparing Eve to someone like Pilate or to those others in the crowd or perhaps among the soldiers who chose to crucify Christ, Eve's decision, which is made again in ignorance and innocence, not from a place of power, not from a place of malice, seems all the more excusable. And so again, some key lines. Her weakness did the serpent's words obey, but you in malice God's dear son betray, whom if unjustly you condemn to die, her sin was small to what you do commit. All mortal sins that do for vengeance cry are not to be compared unto it. So whatever Eve did in, simply giving this piece of fruit to her husband whom she loved, pales in comparison to the sins of men, chief of which is the decision to condemn to die the very Son of God, the one who is most innocent. All mortal sins that do for vengeance cry can't be compared to this transgression. So the decision that men make from a position of knowledge or power is far more to be blamed than the decision that Eve made. And from these premises, she argues against kind of the larger tendency of men to claim superiority over women. And what is perhaps the most proto-feminist part of this poem, she makes a call for equality. She writes, then let us have our liberty again and challenge to yourselves no sovereignty. You came not in the world without our pain. Make that a bar against your cruelty. Your fault being greater, why should you disdain our being your equal, free from tyranny? If one weak woman simply did offend, this sin of yours has no excuse or end. And so from these premises where she's arguing that Eve should not bear the blame, that Adam and with him all men are equally culpable or perhaps more culpable for sin. They are just as capable of making bad decisions as women, or perhaps more capable. Then why should women not enjoy some measure of equality with men in this world? So those are just a few of the key points that Lanyer argues in her poem, Eve's Apology in Defense of Women. Now let's turn to Sor Juana's poem. And this was appended in your reading. It was appended to her reply to Filotea de la Cruz. And it's certainly related to the work that we read by Lanyer, but I also don't think it's unrelated to what comes before in Sor Juana's writing, to what she's talking about in her reply to Philotea. Again, in that work, she argues that she was compelled by others to write, and now she is being blamed for it. And that's an idea that I think will come to bear on this poem. But like Lanyer, Sor Juana targets the tendency of men to blame women for misdeeds, when the men should bear much of the guilt, at least in equal measure, if not more, of the guilt. And so Sor Juana focuses not on the biblical story here. She focuses on how this dynamic plays out in the matter of personal relationships. So while Lanyer is focusing on the cosmic drama of temptation and sin, first in the story of Adam and Eve, and then in the judgment of Pilate over Christ, Sor Juana brings her reflections down to kind of a more a down-to-earth level, the level of day-to-day relationships, particularly between men and women. So some of her key lines here, she says, misguided men who will chastise a woman when no blame is due, oblivious that it is you who prompted what you criticize. So she's talking about how men will often create problems for women or create situations for women. And then after creating these situations, they will blame women for how they react. As she goes on, she speaks more specifically to the kind of situations she's talking about. You strive to topple their defense, and then with utmost gravity, you credit sensuality for what was won with diligence. So if we unpack what Sor Juana is saying here, she's talking about the tendency of men to persuade women to sleep with them, to put it bluntly, right? The tendency of men to when they are in a relationship with a woman, or even just in a more casual relationship with a woman, to essentially persuade the woman to give the men what they want in the area of a sexual relationship. You strive to topple their defense, but then when the woman yields to your persuasion, you call her sensual. You say that she has loose morals, right? Yet you won this with diligence. You worked pretty hard to get what you are now criticizing. She goes on, there is no woman suits your taste, though circumspection be her virtue. Ungrateful she who does not love you, yet she who does you judge unchaste. So essentially, Sor Juana is charging men with never being happy with women, right? If a woman refuses your advances, you call her ungrateful. You call her cold. You say she doesn't care about you. And yet, if she does give in to your persuasion, you call her unchaste. So it's the man blames the woman if she does, and the man blames the woman if she doesn't, right? Who does the greater guilt incur when a passion is misleading? She who errs and heeds his pleading, or he who pleads with her to err? So at whose feet should the blame rest? The one who gives in to the pleading of another, when someone is persuading and pleading and cajoling someone to give in to what he wants? Should that person carry the blame, or should the person who is doing the persuading, the person who is persuading the woman, the person who is urging the woman, in this case, urging the woman to go to bed with him, should that person bear the blame? It's, of course, a rhetorical question, but the answer is obvious in the context of the poem. It's the man who should bear the blame, or at least the man should refrain from criticizing the woman. He should at least share the blame with her. Why for sins you're guilty of do you amazed your blame debate? Either love what you create, or else create what you can love. And so, you men, you will debate, you will puzzle over the fact that women sin in this way, when you are, in fact, a large part of the reason for their sin. This is such a powerful line. Either love what you create, or else create what you can love. So if you have helped to make women this way, women who are willing to give in to your persuasion, then you need to love them as they are, because you have some say in who they are and how they act, or else create what you can love. Inspire women by your example. Inspire women by your leading to be the kind of women that you would call chaste, the kind of women that you would call virtuous. If you bear the blame, men, for persuading women to give up their virtue, well, don't hate them when they do. Were not it better to forbear, and thus with finer motivation obtain the unforced admiration of her you plotted to ensnare? So rather than giving in to your desires or persuading women to satisfy your desires, isn't it better to have patience? Isn't it better to motivate in better ways by loving women, by treating them as they deserve to be treated? And in doing so, you will earn their unforced admiration. You will not compel women to love you. Instead, they will respond in love. You don't have to ensnare them. Instead, you can love them and cherish them, and in doing so, they will become both the women that you long for them to be, but they will also enter into relationship with you that is not tainted by that kind of persuasion, that is not tainted by that kind of cajoling. And finally, Sor Juana ends with what is kind of a pessimistic shot at men. But no, I deem you still will revel in your arms and arrogance, and in promise and persistence join flesh and world and devil. So you may speak of virtue, men. You may say that what you want is virtue, but instead, in your action, you by promise and persistence join flesh and world and devil. You bring sin, and particularly the sins of the flesh, to bear on your world in the ways that you behave towards women. So both of these poems, again, written by women who grew up in very different situations, who lived very different lives in a lot of ways, has a lot to say to the relationship of men and women at their time, both in the church and in the larger society, but also in a way, sort of arguing for the voice of women to be recognized, arguing for the voice of women to be heard, and arguing for men to respect women more than they do. And so rightly, these poems are read in conjunction with each other, or can be read in conjunction with each other, and in a lot of ways can teach us a lot about the mentality of early modern literature, especially that produced by women. So thanks very much for your attention, and I hope that this is helpful, and I hope to see you in class soon.